Hello, everybody. Nice to see you. Welcome. So, what does freedom actually mean? What is spiritual freedom all about? And what does spiritual freedom actually mean? It's not as obvious, I think, what spiritual freedom is all about, what it actually means is not, I don't think it's as apparent as it might seem to be. And it's a rather complex inquiry, I've come to find. The meaning of freedom, the meaning of the experience of freedom, the meaning of the experience of inner freedom, the meaning of the experience of spiritual freedom. So what is that all about? Now, spiritual freedom in the highest sense, in the most profound sense, is a state of consciousness. When we awaken to enlightened awareness, when we have the experience, the dramatic experience of awakening to enlightened awareness, the awakening to enlightened awareness is always the experiential recognition and thrill of profound inner freedom. When people wake up, they usually experience a state of ecstasy. They experience this as a state of ecstasy and often describe it as an ecstatic revelation, that is an ecstatic discovery of the nature of inner freedom. So freedom is essentially, if we scrutinize our experience and analyze our experience, the experience of inner freedom as a higher state of consciousness, the state of consciousness that we experience when we awaken to enlightened awareness, is the discovery of the feeling of being, the nature of being is an ecstatic experience of inner freedom. The feeling of being itself, pure being, is the experience of I amness. It is the felt cognition, recognition, revelation, insight into the nature of existence, presence. It's the feeling of being. It is the most primary and fundamental dimension of our shared experience of consciousness. What is the most foundational dimension of your and our experience of existence? It's the feeling of being. It feels like something to exist. To exist feels like something. And I'm not talking about the different kinds of gross and subtle experiences we have. I'm speaking about the foundational ground of our experience, which is the feeling of being, the feeling of being. The feeling of being can be found when we begin to explore the nature of consciousness itself, because the feeling of being is synonymous with the feeling of consciousness itself. Consciousness, in the way I'm using these terms, consciousness and being are the same thing. So, as human beings, when we speak about the experience of being human, we often describe that we have all kinds of experiences. We have all kinds of gross and subtle experiences, pleasant experiences and painful experiences, high experiences and low experiences, meaningful experiences and meaningless experiences. But I'm not speaking about what happens in the context of the human experience. I'm not speaking about the different kinds of events that happen within the nature of being and the nature of consciousness itself. But I'm pointing to the foundation the foundational ground of all experience, which is being or consciousness itself. And as most enlightenment teachers point out to us, they say that we always have our attention on that which happens within consciousness, the arising of thought, the feeling of the body, the awareness of time, and gross and subtle objects, from the computer screen that we're looking at to the Milky Way galaxy. These are all objects that appear to arise in an infinite context, and that infinite context is consciousness or being itself. So when we wake up, and what waking up means is that we suddenly become conscious or self-aware of, or cognizant of, the context, the ultimate context in which all these objects arise. And that ultimate context is what Eckhart Tolle calls the ground of being, is being itself, or we could say consciousness. And the ground of our experience, which is being or consciousness, if we pay attention to it, if we try to look for its boundaries, we won't be able to find any boundaries in the feeling of being. Because if you pay attention in your own experience, and you can even do that now as I'm speaking, if you pay attention to the nature of your own experience of being, your own cognizance of being, your own awareness of being, your own experience of the feeling of being, you'll begin to become aware of the fact that being or consciousness is the foundational dimension of your experience in every moment, is without boundaries, seems to be the ground of all experience, and seems to be literally everywhere and nowhere in particular at all times. Being, or the feeling of being, or consciousness itself, which is the foundation of all experience, seems to be everywhere and nowhere. And if you don't believe me, take a look. Take a look into the nature of your own experience right in this very moment of being or of consciousness itself. And consciousness or being, it cannot be located in any particular place. It does not exist here and not exist there. Being is felt and experienced to be everywhere and nowhere in particular. Timeless and formless and beginningless and endless is the nature of being, or the feeling of being. The practice of meditation, the experience of meditation, is the pursuit, at least in my understanding, is the pursuit of the recognition and the awakening to the experience of being or consciousness itself, free from any identification and attachment to any particular object or objects that seem to arise within the infinite, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless eternal field of being itself. So when the experience of the meditative process awakens us directly to enlightened awareness itself, meditation becomes the experience of enlightened awareness itself, when we find that we are naturally, spontaneously, effortlessly, and ecstatically free from compulsive identification with the objects that arise in consciousness, that arise in the ground of being, and find ourselves captivated by the eternal nature of being, captivated by the presence of eternity, which becomes knowable and discernible within the infinite context of being itself. And when you become cognizant of the presence of that which is eternal, one becomes irresistibly compelled by the presence of eternity. Just in the same way, when you're watching a candle flame in a dark room and you can't resist the light, being attracted to the light, the flickering of the light of the candle, when you discover, become conscious of, or awaken to the presence of that which is eternal, it becomes irresistible, and one finds oneself naturally and effortlessly, one's attention naturally and effortlessly concentrated and focused on. We could call it a meta object, even though it's not an object, it's not a thing, which is eternity itself. And eternity is, that's like, as I repeat, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless. But eternity, the awakening to that which is eternal, the recognition, the conscious recognition of that which is eternal, is the foundation of spiritual liberation, is the foundation of the awakening. It's a deep and profound enlightenment and the potential for extraordinary and meaningful liberation from samsara, from meaninglessness, and from being lost in a confusing experience of being human in a crazy world. So the awakening to what I'm describing as being or consciousness, the recognition of being or consciousness, which is, as I've been saying, which is the foundation of all experience, which is the ultimate context in which all experience arises. Inherent in that recognition is the profound experience of ecstasy or freedom. Because that which is eternal, timeless, formless, beginningless, and endless, that which exists everywhere and nowhere, its nature as an experience, the nature of eternity as an experience is the experience of inner, ecstatic, limitless freedom itself. And this is what the awakening to enlightened awareness is all about. When you wake up to consciousness, when you discover the nature of being, which is the ground of all of our experience in every moment, and the foundation of all of our experience in every moment, we go, oh my goodness. The foundation of reality, the foundation of my very experience of reality from moment to moment is freedom itself. Wow. I didn't know that. Nobody told me that. Why didn't anybody tell me that? And the freedom we experience when we awaken to consciousness, when we become conscious of consciousness, when we awaken to being directly, the freedom we experience is incomparable to any other kind of experience of freedom. It is absolutely beyond comparison. It's truly non-dual because it contains absolutely everything and it's free from absolutely everything. Its nature, the nature of being itself, which is not separate from the nature of consciousness itself, is freedom itself, already, always, eternally for eternity. So this is the big shocking revelation of the awakening to enlightened awareness, is the recognition that, oh my goodness, my true nature is freedom. The nature of your true nature is freedom already. And it's not a freedom that needs to be cultivated or developed, because it is self-existent. It's inherent in the nature of being, in the ground of your own being, in the nature of your own consciousness already. And once again, the reason that we seem to miss this profound and significant truth is because we tend to be very focused and distracted by the objects that arise in consciousness in the form of thoughts, feelings, memories, fears, desires, worldviews, opinions, and on it goes. But when you discover the very ground in which everything arises, in which all objects arise and all things arise, you'll recognize that what I'm saying is absolutely true. And of course, the ultimate miracle is that when we awaken to being, we recognize that being is also synonymous with the deepest felt sense of I, or I am, the feeling of I-ness, the deepest, most innermost, profound sense of self, with a capital S, is the nature of being or consciousness already. So that in that awakening, there's the recognition that I am as the self with a capital S, which is synonymous with pure being or pure consciousness. Freedom. It's a freedom that the ego doesn't know anything about. It's a freedom that the ego doesn't know anything about, poor ego. The ego doesn't get it. The ego's always looking for freedom somewhere else. So in all the ways I've been describing it to you, which is very ancient. This is an ancient revelation. The freedom I'm describing, you usually experience, human beings usually experience and discover as a state of consciousness. When you experience a higher state of consciousness, the nature which I've been describing as being or consciousness itself, the state is experienced when the ego's entire story and everything that the ego is concerned about and worried about, feels passionately about, longs for, is utterly, radically, and absolutely and completely transcended. When you awaken to being and to consciousness directly, the ego disappears. And when the ego disappears, the ego's story disappears. When the ego's story disappears, and you find, aha, my ego with all its problems and fears and desires is gone, but I'm still here. Wow. When my ego's gone, I like myself much better. I am happy and I am free already. And I am vibrating with ecstasy and love and inner freedom and joy. So in this higher state of consciousness in which the ego is transcended, freedom is a state of consciousness that's realized, recognized, discovered, cognized. And that's the goal of all spiritual practice that leads to the awakening to enlightenment or enlightened awareness. It's all about that. It's very simple, really, once you understand it. It's not complicated. We like to make it more complicated than it really is, but it's very simple. Doesn't mean it's always easy. So what I've been describing to you for the last few minutes is freedom as a state of consciousness, freedom as a spiritual experience, freedom as a metaphysical revelation, freedom as effortless and spontaneous being. It's the freedom that liberates us every time. So that's one kind of freedom, and we can call this freedom absolute freedom, because there is a difference between what's called absolute freedom and what's called relative freedom. And they are not the same thing. Absolute freedom is a state of consciousness, is a spiritual experience, which is a higher state of consciousness. Is what absolute freedom is all about. But when we use the word freedom, most of the time, when we don't usually, most people don't usually speak about freedom as a metaphysical revelation that it reveals itself to us in an absolute context. In a relative context, which is a place, a space, a location, a dimension of reality that most of us spend most of our time in relative reality, working with the cumbersome biological processes of the body, working within biological and cumbersome processes inherent in our biological experience, working within the confines of a complex mind that's working on multiple levels, seen and unseen, to help us to navigate our way through time and space, working in the middle of the complexity of so many fears, so many desires of all kinds that can seem to emerge at any time, regardless of what we may think we want or don't want. And then there's the issue of the small self. So it's usually, not always, but it's usually the small self. It's trying to navigate its way through all the complexity of biological impulses, complex cognition, challenging emotions, and so many conditioned ways of thinking that we find that in terms of relative reality and relative existence, the domain of the small self, which is an important place, an important aspect of reality, we find ourselves burdened with the challenge of having to make so many decisions. Should I get out of bed? First, should I get out of bed today? Should I brush my teeth? Should I make a cup of coffee? Should I get dressed? Should I take a bath? Should I go to work? Should I do this or should I do that? Some choices we make for different kinds of reasons will help us to experience more or less relative freedom. The fundamental point I'm trying to make through this talk is that spiritual freedom, the highest experience of spiritual freedom, is not a choice, but it's a state of consciousness. Whereas in relationship to relative freedom, relative reality, it's a realm where so many choices have to be made from gross to subtle, from easy to complex, from challenging to not so challenging. We have to make so many choices, and so we notice that certain choices help us to feel more free. Certain choices enable us to experience greater freedom. Other choices lead to us feeling less freedom, more victimized, more burdened, more out of control. So if we're serious about, at least in my thinking, if we're deadly serious, absolutely deadly serious about radical spiritual transformation, then we are interested in, we're not only interested in the absolute freedom, which is a higher state of consciousness, but we're also interested in learning how to be proficient navigators of relative reality, so that we can learn how to make more and more of the kinds of choices that will enable us to feel greater and greater relative freedom. And usually you can tell very much what a human being is made of, what they're all about. You get to know somebody well by the kind of choices that they make in relationship to their cultivating greater and greater relative freedom in and through the human experience they're having, by the kinds of choices they make, and by what's motivating those choices. Now, one of the most intriguing things about this inquiry that I'm bringing up today is that, to me, is that the conscious experience of absolute freedom, metaphysical freedom, spiritual freedom, the freedom of enlightened awareness, the freedom of being, the freedom of consciousness itself, that the experience of freedom, which is a higher state of consciousness, most of the time will inspire us and compel us to make choices in relation to relative reality that will enable us to experience greater and greater freedom within the complex world of relative reality. Remember, in absolute reality, there's no good, there's no good, and there's no bad, there's no right, there's no wrong. There's no truth, there's no falsehood. There's just being or isness. There's no duality at all. That's why it's akin to heaven itself. Heaven exists beyond all notion of duality. And to transcend all notions of duality, we need to transcend all pairs of opposites. But the world of relative reality is a world of opposites. And it's when, and in order to live a meaningful, purposeful, constructive life requires us to make, at times, difficult choices that may involve enormous emotional, psychological, physical, spiritual effort sometimes. Sometimes to do what we have concluded is the right thing is physically, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually harder than doing the wrong thing. Too bad. So I'll repeat that just for emphasis because it's important that sometimes in relative reality, making the choice to do the right thing may take greater effort from us, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, than what we would determine would be the wrong choice. Relative freedom, the experience of relative freedom is a choice. Is a choice, and it's not always an easy choice to make because we don't all have good habits. Some of us have very good habits of all kinds. Some of us have bad habits. Some of us have had an easy time of it. Some of us have had a very hard time. Some of us have been loved and nurtured and cared for. Some of us have been abused and traumatized. And all of these different kinds of conditioned experiences create conscious and unconscious levels of ambivalence insecurity, confusion about what the right choice to make is all about. Because you truly have to love yourself, small s and big S, small s. You truly have to love yourself, number one, which seems to be a difficult thing for many of us. You truly have to love yourself, and you truly have to love life. You truly have to love yourself. You have to believe in yourself, respect yourself. And you have to love life itself deeply and profoundly. In order to be able to consistently make those choices, those positive and life-affirming choices that will enable you to experience greater and greater degrees of freedom in the context of relative reality. So in my understanding and the way that I teach, I like to introduce people to absolute reality so they can experience absolute freedom. So they can experience the absolute freedom, which is the nature of their own true, capital S, big S self, which is the nature of being, the nature of their own consciousness always already. We need to have that kind of experience many times until we become convinced that I am that. I am freedom. I am freedom in which there's no duality, in which is only pure positivity and ecstasy, and one big screaming, overwhelming yes that is nothing less than the voice of God. And this kind of experience, as I explained a few minutes ago, can completely transform us from unenlightened to enlightened. But in the most important way this kind of experience can transform us is because if you've been lucky enough to have a revelation of the nature of absolute reality, which not so many people have, but if you've been lucky enough to actually have directly glimpsed the nature of absolute reality, it will inspire you to reach for the highest, to make the noble struggle to reach for the highest in the context of relative reality. Because you will have seen what's really going on here from the highest perspective. Could it be possible? Yes, I'm saying it is possible. You've seen what's going on here from the highest perspective. And seeing that and knowing that, this glimpse of absolute reality becomes your North Star. If you've seen the absolute truth, and you have allowed yourself to be deeply touched by it, you begin to naturally, spontaneously, and effortlessly aspire to become one with it, with the totality of your being. As we're all already well aware, we are all works in progress. None of us are perfect. Most of us are too bad. Most of us are far from perfect. And we notice that when we awaken to absolute reality, we experience the nature of perfection. That's what non-duality reveals to us. The nature of perfection can only be realized as a higher state of consciousness, not as the nature of relative reality ever. Because relative reality, including you and me, is a work in progress. So glimpsing the nature of absolute reality inspires those who have been touched by the absolute. It inspires us to reach higher. It inspires us to aspire. It inspires us to aspire to perfect ourselves as much as possible, to improve ourselves in every way we possibly can, so we can become the clearest and the purest and the truest reflection of that perfection that exists beyond time and space. That's how we express our devotion to this absolute principle, is through the effort of self-perfection. That's where we discover the source of caring about self-improvement, but of course it's not just self-improvement, improvement of the whole world process, which of course even now, as we all are so painfully ever more aware, is in desperate straits. But the longing, the feeling of a desperate longing, not only for self-improvement and self-perfection, but the improvement of the world process and the perfection of the world process comes from this revelation of the nature of God, or the nature of the Absolute itself, directly. That's where we find the strength, the energy, the determination, the conviction, and the spiritual self-confidence that makes it possible for us to make those kinds of choices that will bring us closer to the experience of freedom in a relative context. So absolute freedom is a state, relative freedom is a choice. And they don't come as one package. The experience of absolute freedom is a result of surrender of the ego, surrender of the mind, letting go of the ego, letting go of the mind, letting go of our arrogance, self-importance, and narcissism, and pain, by the way, also. Letting go of all of it. Letting go unconditionally, absolutely, and completely of all of that is what opens the revelation to the nature of absolute reality, of absolute non-duality. The relative freedom becomes a tangible experience for us when we find the courage and the determination to make noble effort, right effort. At times heroic effort if necessary, to do the right things, to do the right thing at the right time for the right reasons. And as I'm sure you all have already discovered, life gives all of us many opportunities to do that. And sometimes we succeed gloriously and fabulously, and sometimes we fail tragically. But as I said, we're all works in progress, as the whole evolving universe is a work in progress. So absolute reality, absolute freedom is a state of consciousness that is revealed directly to us through surrender of the mind and of the ego and of all of our suffering. Relative freedom is discovered through cultivating the capacity to make the right choice for the right reasons at the right time. It requires self-discipline and self-respect and a moral compass that's in good shape, it's not damaged. What defines each and every one of us as a unique human being is in the end the choices that we make, the conscious choices that we make. Of course, the ground of our being is freedom. That's always the case. That's always already the case, whether we know it or not. And if this is something you have deeply realized, if you have deeply awakened to enlightened awareness, it will show through the kinds of choices you make in your relationship to relative reality. If this is something you have deeply realized, and I mean deeply realized, you won't be able to hide it. It'll become obvious because the choices you make and the actions you take in your relationship to relative reality will demonstrate the presence of a profound mystery that transcends life and death. But I'm just trying to make this point that who you are as a person, who I am as a person, who we all are as unique individuals, is defined ultimately over time through kinds of choices that we make. So the inspirations to give this talk came because I realized that many seekers are under the false presumption that freedom is an experience to be attained, either through the grace of God or through spiritual practice. That is a state of inner freedom is to be attained through the grace of God or through spiritual practice. And once attained, that state of freedom is one's constant companion. And from that point on, all effort, all choice has vanished. And one simply is the nature of freedom itself. And that's all one expresses. But it's not really true. Enlightenment is more complicated than that because we human beings are more complicated than that. And at least in the way I approach this, the way I understand this, and the way that I teach this, I think that we need to work on both. What does that mean? It means we need to work on our capacity to surrender the fears and desires, compulsions and aspirations of the small self. We have to learn how to surrender the whole world of the ego unconditionally, absolutely, radically, completely, and all of our attachments and all the bondage therein. To learn how to let go of all of it without conditions. And through learning how to let go in this way and meaning it, spiritually meaning it, really meaning it, that we find access to this absolute dimension of reality. And simultaneously, we have to work on self-discipline. We learn how to make those choices that's going to make us a stronger, more ethical human being. To meet human beings that are morally inspired, not crazy self-righteous lunatics, but people that are ethically inspired, in which you feel a humility that comes from the aspiration for self-perfection, self-improvement. It's very moving. You say, oh, I realize this person really cares. This person really cares, and they are in touch with the preciousness of life, the rareness of the opportunity of having, the rareness of the recognition of having an opportunity to consciously evolve, and what that means about the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of the life principle, and how sacred all this is, and how sacred life actually is depends not upon how sacred life always already is, but how much do we recognize it? How awake are we? Do we recognize the inherently sacred nature of the opportunity we have to make the world a more conscious and a more beautiful place? Do we feel any obligation in relationship to that possibility? Or do we just not care? Or we're just on an ego trip? So caring like that takes guts, it takes courage, it requires renunciation and self-discipline. To care. And to make the kinds of choices in our personal life that are reflections of that kind of care. So, absolute freedom is a higher state of consciousness. Is a state of unparalleled, unimaginable, ecstatic freedom. Relative freedom is a choice. The greater our access, the greater our attainment, the more profound is our experience of this, of the feeling of being. The greater our attainment to the feeling of being, the easier it's going to be for us to make difficult choices in relative reality that will lead us to greater freedom, deeper humanity. So it's easy and it's hard. When you feel free, it's easy to be free. When you feel free, it's easy to be free. And when you don't feel free, it takes effort to be free. But I think what to me, what is more valuable than the capacity to demonstrate and express inner freedom when you feel free, when you're in the higher state of consciousness, is the willingness to make the noble effort to do the right thing that expresses profound freedom when it's the last thing in the world you feel like doing. That has greater value. And the experience of ecstasy and joy that comes from the nature of the self itself. So this gives us all a lot to work on. I know you're all very busy, but spiritual enlightenment, evolutionary enlightenment, requires a little time and effort and consideration. Time, effort to consider who am I? Who are we? Why are we here? Why does the universe exist? Is it a good thing that the universe exists? Is it a good thing that we exist? We've got to figure all that out and come to some pretty convincing answers before we can figure out what the right thing to do is. Yes, we're aware of what everyone else is doing, but if we aspire to become a conscious person, we're not necessarily interested in simply doing what everyone else is doing, which is what most people do. Most people simply do what everyone else is doing because they haven't really taken out the time to think about absolute questions, ultimate questions, existential questions, philosophical questions, metaphysical questions, moral questions. And if you haven't taken out the time to ask these kinds of questions, if you're not working constantly on these kinds of questions, how can we possibly know what we should be doing? What's the right choice to make? This is a challenge for all of us. Making sense out of the human experience. Making sense out of the human experience, not just for yourself, but for everyone else. Anybody who truly makes sense out of their own life gives everyone else a gift, a big gift. It's not that anyone else is going to recognize it, but the gift is there to be had. I remember a great Tibetan Rinpoche that I met about 25 years ago in Nepal told me that he said, you know, a living Buddha could be sitting at a table with 5 other people. And unless each and every one of those 5 people had attained the level of consciousness that would make it possible for them to recognize who they were sitting with, they wouldn't even notice who they were sitting with. So consciousness and the evolution of consciousness is a journey from the gross to the subtle, and it's an enormous challenge. It's tricky business. And what freedom is all about is also tricky business. Because freedom is not only a feeling, and it's not only an experience, it's also a choice. So you can see from the perspective of what I've been sharing, you know, a lot of people, sorry, what I wanted to say was, from the perspective of what I've been sharing, we're always on the hook, we're never off the hook. Because I think, I think the way a lot of people tend to think about enlightenment is that they'll say, well, whatever enlightenment is, once I get there, the idea is, what I think is the wrong idea. The idea is that once I get there, I don't have to make any effort anymore. Everything's going to be easy. And just, I'm on a free ride from then on. Which is how some people describe it. It's just not what my experience is all about, and I don't believe that that's the case. So I'm describing a perspective in which we're always on the hook. There's always more to be done. There's always farther to go. There's always more to attain. And then we want to deal with questions like, I suppose, I probably should stop talking now. Then we have to deal with questions, I suppose, after we die. Were we sincere in your relationship to your own life, and for each and every one of us? This life is a great opportunity that we've been given. Were we sincere? Were we playing for keeps? Or were we leaving ourselves a little room? Always waiting for options. I remember I had a teaching once, a long time ago, which went something like, freedom, profound spiritual freedom, means there's always only one choice you can possibly make, which for the ego feels like a complete bad deal. If there's only one possible outcome or one choice you can make, the ego feels this is a bad deal. I want to go to another bookie. But if you really wake up and you see what the stakes are, and you glimpse the way reality looks from beyond the vantage point of your ego, you begin to glimpse what that one choice would actually look like, which is your ego's worst nightmare. your ego's worst nightmare. Your ego's worst nightmare is your true self's salvation. It's really gets brutally simple at a certain point. So the ego's saying, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I go here? Should I go there? Should I do this? And of course, in this day and age, you all know we have so many options. That's why part of the reason why we're all going so crazy is because of this. We have too many options. It's driving everybody nuts. But if you truly choose freedom, you'll find, and you'll see this for yourself, that you only have one choice. And when you begin to feel that you only have one choice, that's when you feel your ego is starting to lose its grip. And that's a moment to celebrate, to be grateful. So freedom is a state, a higher state, but it's also a choice. And then I just added one more piece to the puzzle. It's freedom is absolute freedom is a state of consciousness. It's also a choice. We can add to that, it's also a choiceless choice. And when you find that freedom has become a choiceless choice, it means that, at least spiritually or metaphysically, you're in good shape. It means you're no longer divided. When you're no longer divided, you're well on your way to what the Buddha called the yonder shore. So freedom is a higher state. Freedom is a choice. And ultimately, we can say freedom is a choiceless choice.